Hey folks, this is Andrew Crocker for our last lecture of the semester. Can you believe it? You are going to miss the sound of my voice, I know you are. The soothing, deep timbre of my tone or something. You will miss me. I know you will miss me, but here we are on our last conversation of the semester, and it is going to be over the final chapter, which is foreign policy. Foreign policy it's something we could have an entire class on. As a matter of fact, we do have an entire class on foreign policy here at OTC. It's offered once, I think, a spring by Dr. Lauren Lundstrom. It's on international relations. So give it a look. I don't know if he'll be offering it beyond 2020 for those of you listening to this in the future. But nonetheless, should consider it. As what we will be doing is we will be doing the quickest of flybys on foreign policy. I really just want to cover the top end things, and I don't want to mire ourselves too much in one issue after another occurring in foreign policy. I just want to talk about the issue as a whole. So let's waste no further time and get down to it. First things first, let's make sure we know what it is. What is foreign policy? Make sure you know what it is. Now, the textbook has a fine definition. This is your textbook definition. Countries' external goals and the techniques and strategies used to achieve them. But foreign policy is just anything dealing with stuff outside the United States, folks. That's all it is. And I talked about this at the beginning of the Chapter 13 lecture. I'll talk about it now. If you see a question on the exam and it says, which of the following is domestic or foreign policy, you can kind of run down the gamut and try to remember everything I told you about domestic policy or foreign policy, or you can just ask yourself one question. Is whatever I'm throwing in front of you occurring inside the United States or outside the United States? Economic policy, for instance, is happening inside the United States. How we deal with immigration, inside the United States. But how we deal with foreign countries, how we deal with international treaties, international organizations like the UN, those are foreign policy issues, right? Now, when it comes to dealing with other countries and dealing with international organizations, we use a lot of techniques to essentially try to get these other organizations, these other countries, to do what we want them to do. That's essentially, if I may be crass, that's basically what foreign policy is. Foreign policy is just trying to get things outside the United States, other countries, other organizations, to do what you want them to do. And there's really one of two ways you can do that. You can exercise soft power, or you can exercise hard power. And we'll talk about hard power in a moment. But first, let's talk about soft power. Soft power, in short, is just trying to attract and persuade other countries to act in your favor, or other organizations as well. If we're talking about like NATO or the EU or the UN, whatever, if you want these countries, these organizations to act in your favor, you can persuade them, convince them that it's the right thing to do. For example, diplomacy. We have an entire department in the U.S. government dedicated to diplomacy. It's called the State Department. We have a Secretary of State, right? Right now, our Secretary of State is Mike Pompeo. Hillary Clinton ran for president in 2016. She was Obama's Secretary of State. So diplomacy is a very, very big deal. And diplomacy is really just anytime you're interacting with other countries peacefully. You want them to resolve their conflicts peacefully. You want to enhance trade, or you want to come to an agreement to combat climate change, or something different than trying to strong arm them into a particular approach. You're trying to convince them, right? You're trying to talk to them, trying to work out whatever issues you may have. In addition to that, another way you can get countries to act in your favor is by foreign aid, also known as economic aid, but really it's just money. We are giving other countries money in the form of grants, or we're giving them money for it to be paid back to us. And essentially, this is a very powerful motivator, as you could probably imagine. There are a lot of countries that could use a lot of our money. We are the richest country on earth. And for instance, we are able to get a lot done thanks to foreign aid. We have a military base in a Middle Eastern country called Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan. Why would the country of Kyrgyzstan allow a United States military base on their land? Could you imagine having like a Brazilian military base in North Dakota? It would be unthinkable, right? Well, Kyrgyzstan's cool with it because they're a poor country and they like having money, and we will give them money if they let us have a military base there. We also can project our ideals. America is very popular worldwide, even kind of during, the Trump administration has been kind of antagonistic with other countries. I think that's fair to say. Even his supporters would probably tell you that's the way he promised to be. And in doing so, our reputation's taken a bit of a hit. But even then, America is still very much the quarterback on the football team of the world community. And so as a result, if you're a country kind of on the fringes of international respectability and you're looking to get back in good graces with the world community, hanging out with us, getting good with us is a real good way of doing that. And perhaps that's what North Korea is doing right now by interacting so kindly with President Trump. Cooperating with us may give them legitimacy and allow them to deal with a lot of other countries that prior to dealing with us may have viewed them as a pariah state. So soft power is when you're trying to be attractive to foreign countries. Now, if you're trying to force foreign countries to act the way you want them to act, that's called hard power. The ability to force them or coerce them to act in your favor. You are no longer playing Mr. Nice Guy. Now you are taking a confrontational approach and doing battle either militarily or otherwise. Now, the most common form of hard power that the United States exercises is called sanctions. And these are punishments in economic and trade. The United States will issue sanctions on you if you are engaged in a bunch of practices that we don't approve of. For instance, the United States entered into a treaty, essentially, with Iran a couple years back. They would agree to tamp down their nuclear ambitions in exchange for increased trade. Us and a bunch of European countries that we roped in on this treaty agreed to lift a whole bunch of sanctions on their country, because with those sanctions, it was really harming the Iranian economy. Folks, I don't know if I've made this clear to you, but trade is really the way your country will make money. The United States only has 5% of the population on the planet, and we are a big country. And so if you want to make money, you need to make money by trading with other countries. And trade exponentially improves your economic standpoint. And that's doubly true for a bunch of these other countries. And if you issue trade punishments on these countries, it can really hurt their economy. And they may agree to do the things you want them to do in order to get those sanctions lifted. Now, a more aggressive version of sanctions is an embargo. And that's just a flat trade ban. That's when we are just banning any international contact with the country. And we still have an embargo on North Korea. We had an embargo for about 50 years on Cuba. That's kind of been downgraded to sanctions at this point. But nonetheless, an embargo is when we just comprehensively disapprove of whatever the country's doing. They don't offer us anything good enough for us to look the other way. So as a result, we slap an embargo on them. In addition to that, military force. Military force is another way that we can force countries. We can invade you, we can bomb you. I probably don't need to define military force for you. But obviously the United States has the biggest and the baddest that this planet has ever seen. Now, this video was recorded in 2019. We are in the 21st century, and the 21st century, really the last 80 or whatever years, has been just an era of internationalism. And really what we're seeing is that countries across the world are cooperating now more than ever before. And that is yielding some seismic effects on how the world acts with things. I mean, first of all, technology has made the world smaller. It is so much easier to communicate with somebody on the other side of the planet in 2019 than it was in, let's say, 1970, right? And even, telephone cables made the world a lot faster, but nothing compared to the internet. The internet has made the world so small and so easy to communicate on different sides of the planet. Now, that's important because a lot of the challenges facing the planet are global in nature. International terrorism, for instance. There are very few countries that are terrorists. Most terrorist organizations are not countries. They're just big organizations that are kind of webbed out throughout the planet. And so one country can't respond to that. It takes a lot of countries to respond to it. Climate change affects obviously the entire planet, and no one country, including the United States, can solve climate change. There needs to be a global solution, which obviously the planet's been attempting to work on now for about 5 or 6 or 7 years. Now, in addition to that, as I said a moment ago, countries benefit hugely by doing business with the rest of the world. If you want to get rich, do well in the United States. But if you want to get super rich, do well globally. In addition to that, we just fight less. The more we interact with each other, we tend to fight less. If there's more negotiations, we tend not to draw swords and fight. If we trade with each other, we're less likely to fight each other. And this is the thing I try to tell students all the time in my brick and mortar seated classes when they're like, what if China gets sick of our crap and decides to invade us? Well, first of all, China can't do anything to us. Our military is so much more dominant. But second of all, China makes ridiculous amounts of money off the United States. Why on earth would China ever fight us? It makes no sense. Now, one of the reasons we interact with each other more than we ever have before is because we've set up a global organization that allows for that, called, there's the flag, the United Nations. This is the biggest organization the world has, and it allows basically every country, almost every country, like I think there's 220 or so countries on Earth, like 200 countries or so belong to the United Nations, and it allows every nation on Earth a place where they can talk to each other diplomatically. And that's not a ton. That's just a room where we can all get together and talk, although it's obviously a gigantic building. But that's a big deal. Just allowing us a blanket opportunity to always be able to talk to each other has had a lot of dramatic impacts on the world, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But first of all, the United Nations basically functions like a confederation. Do you remember this from Chapter 2 and Chapter 3? A confederation is when a central government can't make its members act. The United States, for instance, was a confederation for a short while until the Constitution came along. But that's how the UN operates now. The UN is a confederation. The UN, as a government, can't force any country to act. It can recommend they act. It can try to persuade them to act, but it does not have the ability to force states to act legally. It just does not have that ability. Now, in addition to that, thanks to efforts of organizations like the UN, but predominantly the UN, we now live in an era where civil rights around the globe are respected more than ever. Because as states talk to each other more and more, they understand how important it is, first of all, how important civil rights are, but second of all, how important it is to be seen having civil rights. A lot of really ugly countries that deny civil rights might start adopting civil rights if they feel like it will earn them a warm rapport with their neighboring countries or with other countries across the world. That might increase trade, might increase their attractiveness to other countries, and just yield good things for them. We also live in a world right now where extreme poverty, people that live on less than $1 a day, is on track to be eradicated in a generation if we keep doing what we're doing, and that's always a big disclaimer there. But extreme poverty has been dramatically reduced across the third world countries and across the planet, thanks to actions of many countries being coordinated by the UN, and of course war is at all-time lows. You wouldn't know that from watching the news, but really there's only like one, and I don't mean to like sound crass when I talk about war here, but I think there's only one, maybe two wars going on in the Americas right now. The Americas, other than that, have almost entirely been war-free for the last decade or so. And as a result, obviously we have fewer people dying from wars. And there are still some wars going on across the world. There's about a couple dozen going on across the world, and it's all miserable. But nonetheless, we are living in a time now where there's less war than there's ever been before, fewer war deaths than there's ever been before. Now that being said, there's a very popular, notion about the United Nations. People criticizing it as being too weak, too ineffective. After all, it can't make member countries do anything. There is I should have like a 30 Rock clip pulled up, that great Tina Fey show, where they talk about how the UN can't solve any problems and all it can do is, issue disapprovals and approvals, and how that's not going to scare anybody into doing anything. Perhaps that's a fair criticism. But then oddly enough, people also criticize it the other way, as being too powerful. There is a contingency of people in the world that are worried that the UN may lead to a one world government, where you'll have a United Nations that's not a confederation, but can actually force other countries to act as it wants them to act. There's not a ton of evidence behind this second claim. And I don't know, when you look at the results the UN has had, I wouldn't say there's a ton of evidence behind this first claim either. But nonetheless, these are arguments. The United Nations simultaneously gets criticized for being not effective enough, and for not being powerful enough, and being too powerful. Now, as a result, some favor isolationism, where we really try to abstain from having an active role in international affairs. We should just stay within our own borders and not mess with other countries. I don't know if you earlier this semester I referred to Wakanda, the fictional country of Wakanda. I'll just reiterate it here. Wakanda was a fictional country, but it isolated itself from the rest of the world, hid itself from the rest of the world, right? And so as a result, abstained and was more of an isolationist type country. So thanks to the UN, by the way, we now live in a big happy world. Everybody gets along, right? Of course, that's not true. Matter of fact, despite the efforts of international organizations like the UN and the foundationally important international outreach of countries like the United States, countries still ultimately are just going to act in their own self-interest. We call that political realism. At the end of the day, each country has their own considerations to make, and they're not necessarily going to do what's best for humankind as a whole. Now, doing the best for humankind as a whole would be morally ideal, but these countries, we see each other as culturally significantly different, and as a result, we're only going to really act in our own self-interest. But have you ever heard of, let me shrink this down for just a moment. You ever heard of a Venn diagram? Let me see if I can create one. So this is kind of a Venn diagram, right? And one moment. All right. So countries are going to act in their own self-interest. They're not going to act in what's best for humankind as a whole. But these are not necessarily two competing things. Oftentimes they are. What is in a country's self-interest, what we call political realism, may be distinctively different from moral idealism. That may be distinctly different. And as a result, they may end up doing things that are not morally ideal. But oftentimes, they can be the same thing. Political realism and moral idealism can overlap. For instance, it's in a country's best self-interest to trade with other countries, but when you trade with other countries, that means you're not fighting with other countries and killing people, right? So that's morally ideal. In order to look attractive for trade partners, you may embrace civil rights. Now, you're doing that in your own self-interest to make yourself look attractive, but civil rights is morally ideal, right? You may be working with other countries on climate change, and while that is morally ideal for all the countries to work together to benefit humankind to combat climate change, it's also in each country's best interest, because climate change is going to have foundational economic impacts for every country on the planet. So while these are two different ideas, political realism and moral idealism, they do overlap plenty. Now, let's get back on the foreign policy for a moment. When it comes to American foreign policy, who do we put in charge of American foreign policy? Who in America makes American foreign policy? Well, there are several actors. For instance, the courts might get involved and Congress might pass laws, but ultimately, the most powerful person when it comes to foreign policy is this guy. Or, more recently, of course, this guy. The President. The executive branch is the biggest single power of American foreign policy. Matter of fact, the president can largely act unencumbered from Congress and from the courts when it comes to foreign policy. The president can negotiate all sorts of deals. The president can initiate treaties, although that needs Congress, the Senate to ratify, or trade deals that may need congressional approval. The president can, of course, initiate wars for a certain period of time before Congress legally has to weigh in. The president can communicate directly with foreign leaders. There's really almost no restrictions. There's very few restrictions on what the president can do when it comes to interacting with other countries across the planet, which is crazy because when it comes to those of you that may have watched a debate of the Democrats running for president, or in 2020, if you watch a debate between the Democrat that the Democrats choose and President Trump, you'll notice that most of the time they debate, most of the time these presidential candidates debate and campaign and talk to you about what they will do as president. They're talking about domestic policy most of the time. What we will do for health care, what we will do for immigration, what we will do for environmental policy, what we will do for criminal justice reform and taxes and the social safety net. Presidents spend a lot of time, most of their time, talking about domestic policy when they're running for president. And yet, they can't get any of that stuff done single-handedly. Now, can they? They need Congress to pass laws on everything I just mentioned. So they can work with Congress, but they can't do it themselves. And yet presidential candidates spend very little time talking about foreign policy, despite the fact that they have basically no holds barred on what they can do on foreign policy. So if we were really honest in our presidential campaigns, we'd have these presidential candidates talk, I don't know, I'm just spitballing here, 70% of the time about foreign policy and only 30% of the time about domestic policy. But of course, that doesn't get you votes, right? Americans aren't necessarily going to vote for somebody based on what you're going to do with other countries halfway across the world. They're going to vote for you based on what you can do for them, which is why presidents typically talk about what they will do domestically when they're campaigning. So let's talk about at least some foreign affairs issues. I'm not going to spend any time talking about the Syrian civil war. This is a really touchy issue that I'm going to bounce past, but Syrian civil war is maybe the most brutal civil war that's going on the planet right now. And this is the Middle East over here in the top left. You see Israel is the little green sliver here, and Saudi Arabia and Iraq. But right here in this purple country is a country called Syria. And Syria is mired in one of the most intractable civil wars on the planet. It has devastated millions and millions of lives, either by killing them, of course, or by them having to be refugees across the planet. And the Syrian civil war is intractable. It's not something that's easy for the United States or other countries to just jump in and help sort out, because which side do you want to lose? This is one of those wars where you have two sides and neither one you want to win. First of all, you have a brutal dictator who's comfortable with gassing and killing civilians, women, and children if it means he gets to retain power, a guy named Bashar al-Assad. And then you have radical terrorists. That sounds kind of redundant, right? There's no such thing as a moderate terrorist. But nonetheless, a radical terrorist organization called ISIS, and they are people that are comfortable murdering civilians as well if it gets their way. So which side do you want running this country? Well, really neither. So I don't know what the solution is to this other than to stand back and let them just kill each other for a while. It's kind of what America's ended up doing. Obama sent some troops. Trump sent some troops to Syria just for military training. But, again, who do you train? It's not clear exactly whose side we should jump in on. So this is just an absolutely difficult circumstance. Now, the most vexing foreign affairs issue for the United States is what to do with the country of Israel. Because the country of Israel is really two different countries. It's got groups of Israeli Jewish people and Palestinian Muslims. And both of these groups tend to hate each other's guts. And this video explains, because it's just one country right now, the country of Israel, but there's a lot of Muslims in that country called Palestinians who want to form their own country, their own state. Why hasn't it been a state yet? this video tries to explain.
In May of 2015, the Vatican officially recognized the State of Palestine. They joined at least 135 UN members who also acknowledge Palestine's independence. However, a number of countries, Israel and the US in particular, have failed to recognize the legitimacy of an independent Palestinian state with its 4 million inhabitants. So what's the deal? Why isn't Palestine a state? Among other important political and ideological factors, it really comes down to a lack of definite borders and competing Palestinian governments. It is important to note that this is a particularly controversial issue and we'll do our best to stay neutral. The easiest place to start is with the Ottoman Empire, which ruled over what is now Israel and Palestine since the early 16th century. But following the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved and the British received the now disputed land. Although there were many Arabs living in the area, the British were committed to establishing a Jewish state. However, attempts at negotiating borders within the area were unilaterally rejected by Arab leaders, and the plans were dropped when World War II began. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Jews moved into the British-controlled area as anti-Semitism and the Holocaust flared throughout Europe. After the war had ended, the UN partitioned the area into 2 Arab and Jewish territories in 1947. Jewish leaders agreed to the deal, but surrounding Arab leaders again rejected the proposal and responded by declaring war. The Jews won that war, and on May 14, 1948, Jewish leaders announced that they were establishing the State of Israel on the land they now controlled. They were immediately recognized by the United States, the USSR, and dozens of other countries. Meanwhile, Jordan and Egypt laid claim to the non-Jewish areas left over and incorporated the existing Arabs as Jordanian and Egyptian citizens. For the next decade, tensions rose in the area. In 1967, after a number of small border battles, Egypt kicked out UN peacekeepers and blocked Israel's access to the Red Sea. In response, Israel began the Six-Day War. The relatively powerful Israeli military ended up winning the war, claiming the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights from Jordan, Egypt, and Syria. Since then, the question of whose land is whose has centered on these captured territories versus the borders proposed by the UN in 1947. Following peace talks throughout the 90s and mid-2000s, Israel ceded control of several areas to a limited self-government, the Palestinian Authority. Israel also withdrew their military and Jewish settlers in the region. Things seem to be headed toward a peaceful resolution and possibly even the establishment of an official Palestinian state. But in 2006, Palestinian residents voted Hamas, an organization widely considered a terrorist group, into their parliament, and peace talks collapsed. The new Palestinian government clashed heavily with the old one, and the two split, with the Palestinian Authority governing the West Bank and Hamas governing the Gaza Strip. The ongoing instability between what Israel, Palestine, their populations, their governments, and the surrounding Arab states all want has made it nearly impossible to agree on borders or leadership. Still, in 2012, Palestine was granted non-member observer status by the UN, essentially recognizing the de facto status of the State of Palestine. With more and more countries coming out to support Palestinian statehood, it seems like the only thing left is for Israel and Palestine to come to some sort of lasting agreement. However, disputes about water rights, occupation of land, freedom of movement, and mutual security suggest that reconciliation is unlikely to happen in the near future. Jerusalem, arguably the most holy city in the world, is a focal point for this conflict. To learn more about the city and how it fits into the debate, check out our video here.
So what exactly? All right, so that's a very great video, and the country of Israel was essentially, not Israel until 1947. And a whole bunch of Israelis started moving into land that we saw Palestinians largely living in. And the land was partitioned, which means split up between Israelis and Palestinians in 1947. Now, since then, Israelis have taken more and more land for themselves. Palestinians have seen their land themselves get crunched and stripped of more land, and at some point in this process, they have turned to terrorism on much of the Israeli population to counteract Israel's encroaching land grabs. And so it's a really, really bad situation where we want everybody to be happy, but both parties are acting poorly. And it's not clear exactly how this can be resolved. Is there what we call a two-state solution, which we kind of see in 1947 here? A two-state solution is essentially two different entities occupying the same land. So we have one land here that would belong to Israel and another land here that would belong to Muslim Palestinians. That's the two-state solution. And for years and decades, both sides have said they kind of want to strive towards that. Well, at least the Israeli side says they want to strive towards that. Palestine has never recognized Israel's right to exist. And now that approach seems all but dead. But we'll the future will see what we hold. But under the Trump administration and under the Obama administration, Israel has just taken more and more land. All right, so we talked about Israel and Syria. We should probably talk for a moment about Russia. Russia has been very aggressive over in the 21st century since Vladimir Putin has become their prime minister and has refused to step down. Russia has, for instance, not just meddled in our elections, that's a whole nother conversation that we just don't have time for. They've also physically invaded two countries. This is Russia right here, this kind of beigey country. They've invaded both Ukraine and Georgia at various times in the 21st century. And they have interfered with our free elections, with Ukraine's elections, with Great Britain's democracy they've invaded. And they've just been a huge, huge problem in stirring up discontent throughout the Western world. In addition to that, the world is trying to figure out how best to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, or at least weapons of mass destruction. We call that non-proliferation. What can be done to ensure more and more countries do not get access to nuclear and chemical weapons? Technology is making it easier and easier to develop nuclear power, and it's not unthinkable to think in our lifetimes that we'll see a nuclear bomb in a suitcase, right? And if that's the case, what can we do to prevent countries from getting their hands on that? For years, the United States has been negotiating with Iran to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. We came to an Iran agreement under the Obama administration that would prevent them from enriching uranium, which is needed to create nuclear power. At the same time, we agreed to lift a bunch of our sanctions on Iran, but then the Trump administration pulled out of that, and now Tehran is threatening to make nuclear weapons again. So it's not clear exactly. It's obviously on a country-to-country basis, but this is going to continue to be a vexing problem for your lifetime and your children's lifetime. In addition to that, what about China? China's economic influence has been a big deal. The United States has been pretty combative with foreign countries under the Trump administration, and China's been trying to fill the void where countries are like, oh man, the U.S. is harder to deal with than it used to be. Well, China's like, we're right here. We'd love to deal with you. The problem with that is that China is horrific. They violate human rights. They have at least 2 territories that they possess where people want to be independent, that China refuses to grant them independence. And they run concentration camps in the northwest of China for Muslims, people called Uyghurs is what their name are. About 1 million Uyghurs are in concentration camps in China right now because China's really anti-religious. And obviously if you're Muslim, you are religious. And so China's trying to stamp out Islam in their country by throwing a whole bunch of Muslims that they suspect are religious and throwing them in these concentration camps. So these are some pretty vexing issues, and this is just scratching the surface, obviously. You should take international relations with Dr. Lauren Lundstrom. He's a great teacher, and he'd love to have you. But regardless, that is a relatively short lecture on foreign policy. Thank you for listening to me all semester. I have enjoyed talking about these things. It's my favorite thing to talk about, obviously, political science. And those of you that have listened to each of these and put up with my ramblings and done the best you can to take notes, I wish you all luck, not just this semester, but in future semesters, whether you're a student of mine or not. Never, ever, ever hesitate to email me or call me if you are having problems in your life or with your schooling and you just need a pep talk or you need to bounce ideas off somebody. I would love to be that person. And regardless, if you have any questions about this chapter, just email me. Thank you, guys.